Hi, everyone. I'm David Canfield, the staff writer with Vanity Fair. Thank you for joining this Showrunner Sessions with creators and showrunners of For All Mankind, a truly excellent show that we're so excited to have them, Matt Wolpert and Ben Nedivi. Hello to both of you.
Hey, good to be
Hi.
here.
Season 3 is currently airing, and you guys just got renewed for season 4. So we'll start with the congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, pretty wild.
Pretty wild. And I wanted to use the news as a way to kick things off, to let us into your process a little bit, just in terms of where you guys are in breaking the season, what that looks like physically. Are the writers gathered? How are things looking right now?
Yeah, we're in the throes of it. We're in the Zoom room every day. We're writing scripts and in prep meetings and all that fun stuff that takes up 12 to 16 hours of our day every day. But it's one of the fun things about this show is that it is constantly evolving. So it's really, season 4 is going to be totally different than every season before it, as all the other ones have been as well. So we're always keeping ourselves on our toes, even if sometimes I wish that we could just be like, okay, we're just going to the police station again next season, and it's all the same characters, and we don't have to age anybody another 10 years. But it is fun.
Yeah, that's the best part, is like when you take these beautiful actors we have, and every season we're like, okay, how can we make you look older? What can we do? Add some gray hair, some wrinkles here. That it always starts with those meetings, which are always a lot of fun. But yeah, people take it seriously, and I think even from the design standpoint, like looking at the sets, at everything, and seeing how things advance between seasons feels like a nice creative reset for the show and the writers.
Well, let's talk a little bit about going into season 3. Pretty public knowledge by now, and I imagine we have many fans listening, that you guys have gone to Mars, and it was a very known thing going into this season. But the whole conceit of the show being, as you said, jumping ahead in time. What did those early stages of planning, talking with the writers, look like in terms of, we're making this literal leap, this storytelling leap, and we're going to push our characters to even further into the unknown?
It was it's always a lot of fun in the beginning of a season to go in with these. We like to sort of set some time aside at the start of each room of each season where it's just sort of blue sky discussions, even though Ben and I usually have a few kind of set ideas of what the broad strokes of the season are going to be. So we knew we wanted to do this sort of real-time race to Mars, because in researching the science of it, there are these launch windows every 2 years where it's the most ideal time to launch. And it sort of occurred to us like, well, everybody would want to launch within that same window. And so, the space race of the first 2 seasons was really like a tit for tat. We're going to go, then they're going to go, and then we're going to go. But the idea of this kind of multiple spaceships trying to get to a new planet at the same time, we felt like was a great jumping off point. The other sort of goalpost we really wanted to try to hit was not having the journey be the whole season, and then it's the footsteps on Mars, and then
right,
tune in next season. We really wanted to spend some time on Mars in this season and see what, tell that adventure story of like, how do these people survive in a completely new environment, in an inhospitable place, and how do they survive?
So in terms of mapping out that arc, especially as you say, you don't, spoiler alert, take the whole season to get to Mars. The show is very well known, rightly, for these pretty massive season-long arcs that really pay off. So we can't obviously spoil anything, especially for this season, but probably shouldn't go too in depth on even 1 or 2. But I'm curious if you could get really into the weeds with us and talk about what that looks like when you're talking about episode 1. through episode 10, how are you breaking all these big character arcs and thinking about how they're going to intersect? Do you guys have like a giant whiteboard, like a Carrie Mathison Homeland level, like color coding thing? Like what's
Yeah.
going on there?
Yeah, like 14 whiteboards, it feels like. No, I mean,
Right.
I mean, early on, we sat down and sketched out kind of a very rough plan for the show, and we knew early on, because it's alternate history, we didn't want the show to be like jump 50 years ahead and show all the change. I think to us, a big part of the pitch was we want to show change happen and as it happens. And the best way to do that is giving us the freedom to jump between seasons a decade, but also jump in time within the season. Now, it's one thing to say that and come up with that idea.
Yeah.
It's another thing to actually sit with a group of writers and constantly say, why did we do this? Because it is very challenging, and it does test your writing abilities and storytelling abilities, because really, for us, this show was always a show about characters. It's a character drama first and foremost. So as much as we spend time in the room talking about the alternate history and how far in time we want to go and how far in space we want to go, we spend most of our time talking about the characters and their journey. And I think deep down, I think what this show really is about is the story of generations, the story of people's lifetimes. So being able to sketch that out, and I think that character you start with, Aleida Rosales, you see her look up at the moon. We knew very early on the journey this character is going to go on, and a bunch of our characters, And so early on, I can say there's a few characters and a few storylines we had in mind early on. Like we knew where we were going with Ellen Wilson from pretty early. We're like, we knew kind of, we had a goalpost, we had a North Star.
Oh, wow.
But as we go, obviously you see what the actors are doing, you see what writers come up with, and things do evolve. Like we give ourselves the freedom to change things up as we go. But I think overall what's important, each season is we felt, because we're jumping in time, that each season had to feel like a self-enclosed story, that you could tell a beginning, middle, end of each season and still carry forward season to season. So yeah, when you say like we build it out slowly, I think we look at it that way, where we're building all these threads of storylines and characters, and we know in the end they all kind of come together, hopefully in a satisfying conclusion. And that's sort of how we set out. So yeah, the whiteboards, I mean, when we were in whiteboards, now it's all Zooms and Writers Room Pro. But when we did have an office, we had our whiteboards, and then we had this at the top, kind of an alternate history timeline that would like wrap around the room. So whenever someone had like a crazy idea of like what would change with Kennedy or Nixon or whatever, we'd put it up there and kind of keep track of it without distracting from the storyline. So yeah, it's exhaustive at points, but it's fun.
Can you give an example of either more broadly or specifically something that's come out of the show that was more on the spontaneous side, something that wasn't as planned, that came up in the room or was shifted in the room maybe?
It's funny, the character of Molly Cobb is such a great character, and she was a product of the room. So we knew we wanted to tell the story of the Mercury 13 coming back into the space program. But we had this really fun idea of how to kill her off in season 1. and we were just like, when we saw Sonia Walger playing her, we were just like, we can't do it.
Yeah,
She's
so
too
great.
good. And so I think we've come with several different ways to kill her, and just like, we're just like, we can't do it.
No, that's the problem. The trick is, for the show to jump like this, we can't keep all our characters from season 1. But the problem is, as a writer and showrunners, you fall in love not only with the characters, but with the actors who play the characters. And you have to, so it's constantly this really tough thing whenever, even like the whole Gordo Tracy thing, it's, without getting into details, like that was a process where there was like arguments in the room for weeks, if not months, about which way to go. And I think I always feel like in the room, if there's arguments and passion, then we're onto something, that if you're not sure if there's two sides, if it's sort of even, then that feels like the magic that will play out for the audience as well. So.
Because with this show, you're dealing with elements like history and science in very granular, in-depth ways. I'm curious how they impact the writing process, both for the room and for you individually. So let's say starting with historical details. You obviously have this jumping off point of What if we did not land on the moon first and things spiral and go in unexpected directions from there, and the timeline of history is altered? But what's interesting about this season is you kind of bump up against these parallels with, say, something like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which closely reflects the real world timeline, but it's tweaked. So how do you think about major historical events, and perhaps ones that are less known or notable, and maybe amplifying them and tweaking them, figuring them out within the world of the show?
It's probably the most fun that we have on the show, Ben and I in particular, and Ron as well. Like, we're such history fanatics that we could probably just talk about that all day. You know, it's so much fun, to the point where we get a little geeky, where it's like, wait a minute, but if Ford wasn't president in '76, then could Reagan and Schweiker have won at the convention? And it's like, so few people know about that stuff, but like, that is how Reagan became president in '76, is because Ford wasn't the Republican nominee. And so, though, that stuff is a blast, but it's also, you know, part of our discussion is like, it's not like this switch goes off and everything is suddenly different. It's really thinking through like the cause and effect of things.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things we do in season 1 is we pass the ERA, and a big part of that in the show is that these female astronauts come into the program and are sort of like become these images, inspirational images to the nation. But there's another side of it, which is that Ted Kennedy was president when the push was made, and he was more supportive of that than you know, Nixon and Ford were. So it's like thinking through the cause and effect of all this stuff. And you know, with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think one of the things we really wanted to show was, as much as there's progress in certain parts of society or technology, it's not like everything is brought along at an even pace. And it felt like that was both very of that era, but also really, it was kind of, we wanted that to be heartbreaking for people to see, like, oh, look, we're on Mars, but like, we still do shitty stuff, you know? So it's like, humans don't change that fast, really, if at all.
Yeah, and sometimes when things change fast, then there's immediate pushback on change, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's something we're seeing right now in the news. So history has a way of repeating itself, unfortunately. And I think that's something we want to acknowledge with the show as well, that, you know, this is not, yes, the idea of the show is we're going to a more hopeful future, but that's not like, it's not going to be all milk and butterfly and honey on the way there. Like, there is pushback and there are obstacles on the way to that future. So it was important to us to keep that alive within the progress.
Yeah, I think on the other side of it, you do have such a sense of hope within the show, both in terms of the nature of discovery and also in some of the developments we see out of what happened that do push social progress forward a little bit faster. Can you talk a little bit about that element of it, about bringing hope into the show and bringing some kind of understanding, trying to bring some kind of understanding of how things can get better, things can proceed in a way that we haven't seen in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, to us, that was really what this all started with, this idea, you know, is the idea of so much alternate history. And honestly, science fiction a lot is dystopian, is about, you know, darkness and apocalypse and what, you know, what we can't accomplish. And I think for us, you know, when we sat down really thinking about this show, like really early on, it was like this, it has to be about hope. It has to be the idea that if the space race continued, if we kept exploring, if we kept going down the path of discovery, it would lead to greater things. And I think, you know, especially in times like this, it feels like entertainment should maybe do that a little more often. You know, I think that sense also just on a granular level of representation on screen, the idea that, you know, the female astronaut program was killed before it ever began. When we suddenly bring it to life, when we bring in the Mercury 13, suddenly it's showing people why, you question suddenly, why did that happen? A lot of people didn't even know about the history of it. So I think we're also shining a light on certain things that we felt should have a light on them. And I think overall, as we push forward, I think the show is hopeful. The show is, we're going to go further, and the impact that has on Earth is better. But yeah, it's finding that balance, of hope and tragedy that takes. Because the thing with going to space, like even when we went to the moon, Kennedy, we were going to the moon not because we're like, oh, this will be a beautiful moment for humanity. We went to the moon because we were scared of the Soviet Union. We didn't want them to beat us there. It came from fear. It came from a place of fear and nuclear power, and kind of like who's the stronger. And I think that was interesting to us, that sometimes hope, sometimes progress actually comes from a cynical place. And I think that's something we also wanted to capture with the show.
In terms of the science of the show, how much did you know about space travel going into it, and how much research both do you have to do in the writing of it, even just in the blocking of a certain set piece that would require, I would imagine, a base knowledge of that, and in the plotting of arcs that maybe are about the development of a technology? What does that process look like, both for you guys and in the room?
It's really, if you had told me at the beginning of my career that I would be writing like a detailed science-based show about space travel, I would have been like, that there's no way. I really struggle to like calculate the tip at dinner. But over the course of doing this show, I've learned so much that I am pretty sure we could build a Saturn V rocket, Ben and I, now, and it would work. But honestly, we rely so much on our technical advisors, and there's a lot of, we, like Ben said, we do always approach it from character, and from that those discussions happen first, and sort of big ideas about the plot and what we want to do. And then we bring in some of our advisors, like Garrett Reisman, who's a former astronaut, and we pitch the ideas, and they tell us all the reasons why that is not possible in the physical world. And then we have to sort of, there's a conversation about, okay, well, but what if you did this? Or he'll bring up some, like there was I don't remember what our idea was for the Ellen Wilson thing at the end of season 1 with the tank, the tossing of the tank. But we were trying to figure out like how you could perform a rescue with a ship that didn't have any fuel. And he brought up that there was this moment where somebody had to like toss something to another ship in space. And we were like, wow, that's pretty great. So there's always that conversation of, keeping things grounded, but also honoring the drama and the tension and what we're trying to go for. And the thing that gets harder as the show goes on is that, season 1 and season 2 really were more rooted in existing technology that maybe was slightly more advanced or tweaked in a way, or based on a design that almost happened but wasn't able to be realized.
Right.
But in season 3 and in season 4, we're starting to kind of move beyond the technology that is possible on a certain level. And so that's been a challenge, because I think we always want to make sure we're being grounded and not going full sci-fi in that sort of, in the bad way of like, that doesn't feel real. So it's an exciting challenge, but it's something that is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah. Is it something that, as you move beyond even what an advisor could tell you, kind of ironically becomes more rooted in the room or between you guys, where it's like, could this be possible? And what does this say about our characters? Because you get to a point where maybe the science, not that it doesn't matter as much, but you maybe have a little bit more freedom in terms of what you can explore.
What's funny, as I'm sure writers everywhere can attest to, sometimes having more freedom is not a great thing for writers.
Right.
having the sandbox, but knowing what the edges of the sandbox are sometimes helps. So we're strangely more worried about how free we are, because you don't, like Matt was saying, you don't want to get to the point where it just loses any tact to reality. And I think that's why it's important for us, especially as we veer more and more away from actual ships or actual technology, to still ground it in things that are possible, or ideas. And I think this reminds me, even in the early part of the show, while yes, we're using stuff that has been built and you've seen, one of the original ideas that really inspired us was we saw all these plans NASA had that were never brought to life. We saw they had plans for bases on the moon. They had plans for the Sea Dragon. They had von Braun as the guy who had this plan for this orbital ship in Earth orbit and plans to go to Mars. So the thing really that inspired a lot of this was how cool it would be to bring that stuff that was thought of, was imagined, but was never brought to life, and the opportunity to do that. So in a way, even as we're getting into our alt 90s and season 4, I still find us many times when we're thinking about these new ships, this new technology, actually relying on concepts or ideas that either were done years ago and never brought to life, or ideas that are even happening now. I mean, even when we talk about Mars, like we're getting these images from Perseverance every day. And
Right.
Matt and I and Jay Red, our visual effects supervisor, like we're taking these images, we're going, whoa, look at that ridge, let's do that. And look at the color there of the surface. So the fact that we can interact with science as it's happening on this show, and like where they think they could, like for instance, Shackleton Crater is a great example. Like when we thought about where would they put the base on the moon? Where would be the good spot for it? We did go through research with Garrett and the Akutas, and we thought like, what would be a good spot? And we really dug in, and it looked like Shackleton Crater made the most sense because it was deep and the ice would still hold there. And this is just a fiction show with a bunch of writers in a room. A few months later, we saw NASA announce they were going near Shackleton Crater for Artemis program. Like, it's that weird moment of like life imitating art, imitating life. But I think the exciting thing with this show right now, especially with season 4, is that I feel like we're now finally hitting that point where we are right now in terms of science, and where people are looking to build bases on the moon. People are looking to go to Mars. And I think so we're interacting with that even in our writer's room every day.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the set pieces on this show. Particularly, each season premiere, from my recollection, has had one really, really intense, somewhat claustrophobic, and pretty heart-racing sequence. And this one, some light spoilers here, but there's such an imagination there where we don't really know what we're getting into with season 3, and it's Space Hotel, which is not on my checklist. But and obviously there's quite a gripping and dangerous sequence from there. Using that as an example, how do you guys figure introducing a season with a bang, so to speak?
That is something that we always strive to do, is kind of like jolt the audience in the beginning and kind of just say, here we are. That one in particular was really fun because the Space Hotel came from this, we felt like the 90s, there was such an idea of the sort of capitalism boom, and it felt like talking about space tourism and private enterprise joining space travel. Those were things we wanted to touch on. And so we started looking into the idea of what type of space tourism would there be, and this idea of a space hotel came to our attention. And of course, then our immediate sense was we need to do Towering Inferno in space. So we were like, okay, how can we pull this off? Do like a 70s disaster movie just as the first episode of the show. And I'm very happy to say that I think we pulled it off for the most part. It's also the idea of, you think of gravity as zero gravity as the sort of, you never think like, what if there's too much gravity?
Yeah, I did not. I was like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and it's like those, I don't know if you remember those centrifugal rides where you get pinned to the side of the thing and you can turn upside down and stuff, and it's like that idea of just being pinned to something just because of gravity. It was such a interesting idea that it's this unseen monster trying to kill everybody. So that was a lot of fun.
Yes, that to me is one great example of, you have to know the signs to an extent to be able to write that entire sequence.
Yeah.
In terms of the character arcs of this season, I'd love to ask a little bit about Danielle, and where she is positioned, and how planned her arc in the show has been, using her as an example, versus what kinds of things have come up along the way to inform her journey on the show?
Yeah, that's a good example of someone I don't think we had a real, clear idea of where she was going early on. But when we started the first season, we knew, okay, who's going to be in this class of female astronauts. So we had a clear idea for that character, but at that point it was like mostly about Sonia, the Molly Cobb character, and the Sarah Jones, the Tracy character were the ones we're thinking about. But in seeing what Chris brought to the character, I mean, right away you're like, oh my God, this is like an energy force unlike any other. And I think quickly we're like, oh, she would be great in that high Bob situation on the moon. Like you put her with Gordo, like we could see that working. And it was one of I think that's a great example of having, especially in TV show, a freedom where as much as you have an idea of where you want to go, giving yourselves the freedom to go in different directions and detour. And when the story in the room came through of this idea of her sacrifice for Gordo, the idea that she broke her own arm to save his reputation, that immediately told the audience, and it told us, that someone who makes that decision is going places, and the fact that the trials and tribulations she went through even after that decision just felt like such a perfect start for that character and her journey. And so when you see her go through the season to season, I feel like she's had about as much growth as a character as anyone on our show. Yeah. The fact that she's now, the commander on the Mars mission, that's to me the real possibility of a show like this. It what makes it so unique, like that character and even the Karen character, where you're showing how much change someone can go through over the decades. And so it's really, yeah, that's one of those things where with Ellen, I think we knew, okay, she's one of the female cosmonauts. We kind of knew already she's going to be a politician. I don't want to give away
political.
I remember telling that to the actress, and she's like, "What? Really? Okay." And like, even as we were working on season 2, she's like, "Am I am I really going to be president? Is that because I don't?" So, but we as a room, we're planting seeds. And I think that's the fun thing when you know where you're going. You can plant all these Easter eggs. You can plant all these smaller threads early in the season and earlier seasons, knowing that in season 3 we'll be able to finally pay that off. And no, look, did we know we're going to get 3 seasons? No, we didn't. So it's the best laid plans. On some level, the hope is we get the opportunity to be able to tell that story eventually. And we've been lucky enough to get to that point.
The flip side of that is introducing new characters. And this season, you've introduced a number, I think most prominently, Peggy's character, and the introduction of the privatization of space travel, which is also a fairly timely topic over here. Because this show is hinges so greatly on really the way all of your characters collide going towards those final few episodes, how does the introduction of these kinds of new characters change the chemistry of that? And is it difficult perhaps to bring those new ingredients into the mix?
It is difficult, I think, in part because, like Ben said, you become so attached to the existing characters that you have to make an effort to carve out story space for the new character. Otherwise, they're not really going to land enough. And I think, it's also about what each character needs in their introduction. I think for Dev, who Eddie plays, we really wanted to present that character as kind of an unknowable presence. Like he was keeping everybody on their toes. People couldn't get a read on him, sort of, which I think felt very much like some of these tech entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. They were charismatic and you couldn't take your eyes off of them, but they also had this unknowable element to them that was kind of apart from everybody. And so he was really that was a challenging character to bring to life. And I think it really didn't fully come to life until we cast Eddie. And that's one of the fun things about writing for television is, with movies, I think you write the script and then there's less chance to adjust, I think, because we're doing multiple episodes. We can see how an actor is bringing a character to life and then write to that. And so, it's something that the very nature of our show demands that, if we don't want a bunch of 100-year-old astronauts going across the Martian surface with walkers, we have to keep bringing in new characters, and it is a challenge, but it's really fun also because it always keeps the show fresh. It's regenerating the show and introducing new people that you can root for.
In about 10 minutes to all watching, we're going to shift to audience questions. So if you have anything for Matt and Ben that you'd like them to answer, just drop it in our Q&A box and we will hopefully get to it. I'd love to ask a little bit about the mechanics of the room. As you've done a couple seasons now, what kinds of strengths and personalities have come out that have perhaps informed some of the scripts, some of the characters? How has that evolved for you two?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a great question. I think, it's such an inexact science, like putting a room together, because you're reading samples, you're meeting people for an hour, and you're going, okay, I'm going to be with you for hours every day, every week. It's unlike any other job there is, because name another job where you're literally sitting with your coworkers, staring them in the face for like 8 hours and talking. So more than anything, it's the unexpected thing of what we look for, what we've always looked for, is unique, original voices. We want to have as many perspectives as possible. I mean, Matt and I have been in a writing partnership of our own for almost 15 years now. So I feel like we've had our own little mini writer's room going on that whole time. So in a way, we look at it as an extension of that. We look at it as like, what are the other voices, perspectives we want in the room? And also there's nothing better than discovering new talent or people who, we've been lucky enough in our careers to work with some amazing showrunners, including Noah Hawley, Jason Katims, and Ron Moore, and learning how they ran a room, how they ran a show in different ways, and seeing how that informs the process really of not only running a room, but who you want in that room. Mm-hmm. And I think for us with this show in particular, we wanted a balance. It's sort of like putting together a sports team. You're like, well, okay, we got our center, who's our point guard, who's the swingman. And I think on some level, that's what's hard. You can't really throw in a bunch of names at once. We kind of look at it as like, okay, we have this person who's really strong in one particular area. What's a person who can complement them? Or in some way also, I think something Matt and I like to do is like spice things up, like someone who will challenge that or challenge the room at certain points. So it's a kind of evolving thing for a room. We like bringing in new writers every year as well to refresh things up. But our room has been amazing. We've been fortunate to have some of the same writers from season 1 carry on. And I think we're able to find that balance here, mostly based on the experience we've had in previous rooms and knowing what we want and what we want to avoid.
Can you share a little bit about how you two work together and how that has developed over 15 years now, as you say?
We actually don't speak to each other anymore. No.
Makes sense.
We met in college and were friends for basically all through college. But we didn't really work together in writing. I helped produce Ben's thesis film. He was the DP of my thesis film, but it was very much just friendship. And then we came out to LA. We sort of fell into writing together off of an idea we had together. And it just sort of, we found that we worked really well together, and we had a similar, while having different points of view about things, we had a similar sort of mindset about the type of stuff we wanted to do. And I can remember when we were like working late on this feature, and then we watched The British Office in like one sitting, and we were like, wow, who knew a TV show could be that amazing? And then I wound up getting a PA job on My Name is Earl, and I was like, Ben, in TV the writers are in charge. And because we were like, it has to be features, Scorsese, right, and that whole thing. And so we sort of shifted our focus there to try to get into writing television. But it was a challenge because we started out in comedy, and everybody likes to put writers into their category. And so comedy wasn't exactly the right fit for us because our ideas were always a little bit too left of center to get on the air. But then when Noah, when we met Noah and he brought us on to Fargo, that was like, oh, this is exactly like what we want to do. This is the right tone. So that gave us an opportunity to kind of branch out. And it's funny because like you look at For All Mankind and Fargo and you're like, these are not the same tone at all. And I think that's one of Ben and my abilities is to look at the needs of the idea and write to that, as opposed to like, this is our tone. There is some humor in For All Mankind, but it's certainly a little more of an earnest show because it feels like that sense of idealism and drama inherent in space travel is it needs to be a little more serious, for lack of a better word.
I'm curious how, going into For All Mankind, what kinds of influences you looked at, but also on the other side of that, how you wanted to make a space drama and alternate history your own, and maybe twist that for me a little bit. What did that balance look like?
Well, it's interesting because so much of TV right now, and especially science fiction, is based on a book or based on something. There's IP. So right away we were like, okay, we have a show based on our own ideas, and I think in a way we looked at history as our IP. We're like, well, how can we look at history and kind of as a source for ideas? And it really came from that, honestly. Like it came from, I think at the time, Ron, Matt, and I were actually developing a Western. We were kind of interested in doing a Western. Everyone told us, like, you can't do Westerns. No one buys Westerns. Of course, the highest rated show on TV right now is a Western, which goes to show nobody knows anything and don't listen to anybody. So we were like, okay, we're going to pivot. And, a thing that Ron obviously has much of a background in sci-fi and had always wanted to do a story about the early days of Apollo. And Matt and I were kind of obsessed and had worked on a project in the past about von Braun and the history of like Nazis who'd become part of the, creating the space program. And sort of, we started talking, and a lot of the idea came from this idea of like, oh, wow, there's something here where you're not just doing a show that tells everyone they already know about the space program. We're like, here's Apollo 11 again, or here's Apollo 13 again. We've seen that show, we've kind of seen those movies. And by the way, love those movies. I mean, Right Stuff, Apollo 13, love them. But in our way, we're like, oh, here's an opportunity to show Apollo 11 when suddenly you don't know what's going to happen. Are they going to survive? Are they going to make it? And that really opened it up for us. Suddenly the freedom to kind of take history where you want it, and then have the VFX and the technology and the resources to tell that story in a real way is really what inspired this, I think, more than anything. I think we felt at the time, and we feel now, there isn't a show like this on TV. I think, for us, Man in the High Castle was an alternate history show that came out a few years before us, but again, felt very different. It was a show about jumping ahead and seeing how the world changed. And I think in a landscape now where there's so many shows, it really is sort of important to have something that feels different. And it makes sense coming from Matt and I, especially because everything we write feels a little different and never quite fits into any, anything that the execs are looking for. And I feel like that freed us to really create something more unique here that doesn't have really a parallel. I mean, I think every season we go in with kind of like season 2, we did think a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're like, oh, that Cuban Missile Crisis, but on the moon, like, and how would that be? Yeah. So we're always inspired by certain things. Season 3, we were talking a lot in the room about old Westerns, actually, and kind of like, because Mars felt like the Old West and the New World. So we are always informed maybe by movies, but I have to say it evolves. Instead of like from the show, it evolves season to season and what the feeling of that season is. And
episode to episode, by the way. I mean, I think one of the things we try to do is have different episodes with different feelings. So it's like, we always do that, like, blank on the moon, like it's Die Hard on the moon, or it's, like, so there are those inspirational things where it's like, what kind of story do we want to try and tell, and go from there. Even Master and Commander was another thing that we referenced in terms of the travel, traveling to Mars. There was a sense of it. It's more the feeling that a movie gives, like the adventure of that movie was something we were trying to capture in the season, as opposed to like the plot details or character details.
Yeah, even the race to Mars. I mean, you saw from that episode where they're playing sea shanty, you know, like a pirate shanty. Like we did look at it almost like Master and Commander, because space in many ways is like that voyage across oceans, you know, the new ocean, if you will. So I think in many ways, as we do stories of adventure and discovery, you start thinking about those movies or books you grew up with that told those stories.
We're going to start peppering in some audience questions. And again, if you have one, feel free to just drop it in the Q&A box and we'll hopefully get to it. So I'm going to start with a question from WJM, who asks, and you guys touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if there are any other specifics. If any real world current day scientific developments, such as the Webb telescope, have ever altered your story or perhaps been directly incorporated?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think weirdly, you know, I mean, I think the Webb telescope is something that we were very conscious of as it was being developed, and sort of in our world, the Webb telescope is the Thomas Paine telescope. So it was launched much earlier, and that may impact later seasons of the show potentially. But it's kind of like Ben was saying, you know, seeing a lot of the photography of Mars has helped us develop the look of something. It's also the Sea Dragon is a great example of like finding that that historical rocket that was never developed and bringing it to life. And of course, as we got into the space hotel designs, we definitely looked at a lot of the proposals for space hotels that are out there. I think one was called the Von Braun Hotel, which is a little, I think they may have changed that name since we did that episode. But, you know, they always say it's going to be like, we're going to launch in 5 years. So I hope that they do. But yeah, it's always something we're monitoring. My Google newsfeed is basically now all space stuff because I click on so many articles that the algorithm is, like, this guy's obsessed.
All right, next question about a character we haven't talked about yet, and I think one of the best in the show, from Sam Moya, who asks, how did you arrive at the decision to make Margot an asset of Russia? Which is a slight spoiler, but that's season 2, guys.
Yeah, that's way back. Yeah, I mean, Margot is also one of our favorite characters in developing the show. Early on, we kind of really loved the idea of this character that felt different, that you don't see a lot on TV, and seeing her rise from the back rooms of NASA. And I think for us what was fascinating about a character whose mentor was Von Braun, who now, you know, we see what she goes through in that, you know, second episode, seeing that your mentor is thrown into this situation where he's not who you thought he was, and this past that he's kept secret brings that, and he says a lot of the things he says in that episode have played out throughout this show. And it's one of the storylines that we honestly had planned for very early on. We knew we wanted to test her as much as possible. And I think it's interesting, you know, what's amazing about that character and what's fascinating to us is that we didn't want it to just be, oh, she's a Russian asset, but we wanted to tell you that it's a love story, you know, it's essentially a love story. This is someone who loves science, who wants progress, who even her first move, you know, is to save people's lives. Like when she tells them about the O-ring issue, it's because she didn't want innocent people to die. So it's coming from a humanitarian place for her character. And I think it's tragic that, you know, they used her heart, they used love, they used her want of humanity to take her in this darker place. But that feels true to the period and felt very true. I mean, I forget, Matt, but I remember early on in our research, like there was an early NASA figure who was also discovered to be, you know, I don't know if he was a Soviet asset or he was a spy, but you know, the history is littered with these types of stories, and even these heroes or people who went to really high positions have complicated, you know, stories. And I think for us, our favorite type of character is a complex character. We're firm believers. We're not that interested in like, this is a good guy, this is a bad guy, you know. And I think with Margot especially, challenging the audience to really understand what she's going through, and even if you're angry at her, even if you're upset, you know, you've seen her journey, you know why she made every decision, and even if you disagree with it, I think everyone can test the idea of it wasn't easy. It was never been easy. So that story continues to be one of my favorites and something we continue to explore.
Great. Great. Our next question is from Miguel, who loves your show, and asks, as you get further and further away from the divergent point of the moon landing, are you finding it more of a challenge to bring actual historical events into the series, specifically as you get into season 4 and maybe even season 5?
It is a real challenge, and I think it's something we constantly are trying to find new ways to do, because it doesn't feel like even with what we did in season 3 with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which sort of came out of it was sort of similar, but it didn't come from the same path, and it didn't unfold in the same way, but it felt like it was still in the cultural mix of that time. And I think going forward, yeah, it's going to be a lot harder to find those touch points as the divergence becomes greater. But I think there's also ways, like we said earlier, I think sometimes, a divergence is not always a straight line. Like it can go and then it can course correct back towards the mean. And it's like you're seeing now, the Cold War seemed like it was over, and it was like, oh, it's just okay, 90s, that there were some rough patches there, but it was like we were headed in a good direction, and now it's course corrected back to sort of basically what it was in the late 80s, and that sort of that tension. So I think history does repeat itself in a lot of ways, and there are those deeper structural elements of history and society and culture that are hard to change. So that's one of the funnest parts of writing this show for us, is finding out through talking about it with our writers, what would change, what would stay the same, what would be a little different, what would be really different, but just have that kernel of something. So yeah, it's fun.
Our next question from Kimberly Winslow, who asks, how you typically find new writers? So logistical question. Would you seek writers from the WGA platform, for instance?
Everywhere is what I would say. I mean, for us, we try at the beginning to always, we always are trying to read writers, even when we're not specifically looking for writers. I think that's something we've changed in our process. We used to wait until we have a pickup, and we realized then you have like a few weeks and it's impossible. So we've started really trying to read new writers, new samples throughout. So, because you never know when that opportunity comes up. I'd say, I think for us, a lot of it is submissions we get through agencies, but I think the WGA platform has been very valuable, especially during the
troubles
we shall speak of. I thought that was very valuable. I think, I think there's no, just like I was saying earlier about putting together a writer's room, there's no secret recipe to it. I think it's something that Matt and I are still learning, that process of hiring. But I think what I would say in the end of the day is we read a lot of scripts all the time. And the one thing that stands out to me is when something feels fresh and new, and a voice that isn't trying to copy something that's on TV or something I've seen, but feels like something different. Even if it's a voice, even if it's a character, that really does stand out, and stands out to us, especially. I think something that we also take pride in is writers that never quite fit in to comedy or drama or any specific genre. We always say, do not, in the beginning, everyone's instincts is send in their sci-fi sample, send in the Star Trek stuff, send in the sample of the most sci-fi thing. In fact, we go out of our way to fill our room with writers who aren't necessarily with sci-fi background. We love having comedy writers, different genres, and with the same with our cast, by the way. We feel like that idea of only hiring people who've done the type of show you've done is sort of short-sighted and limits the perspectives you're getting in a room. So in fact, yeah, we've gone out of our way to kind of find a more broad sense of voices.
Our next question is from Mike Source, who asks, as you go into next season, how challenging is it to incorporate the main cast as their characters continue to age?
It's trickier and trickier. I still think back to when we would meet, Ben and Ron and I would meet at Jerry's Deli in the Valley when we were breaking the show in the very beginning, and we were like, what if we jump a decade?
A new friend.
It's a nice spin on it.
It's a nice spin on it, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, our next question comes from Ian Maddox, who notes to start that For All Mankind has certain powerful moments in every episode that Ian refers to as the triumph of the human spirit moment, which I think is a good way of putting it. Yeah. Moments that include beats of sigh of relief, claps and cheers. Is there a particular approach you take to building these triumphant story beats, or is it even something you consider when breaking story?
That's a great question. I mean, I think early on, it's interesting because early on we looked at the show as an opportunity to tell those kinds of stories, for sure. Because when you're telling a show, when you're writing a show about space exploration, and science and technology are such a key part of that show, I think inevitably you're finding yourself in situations where the show is so much about the engineers on the ground and the astronauts in space, right? And it's the interplay between them. And I think for us, we love those moments of it's the Apollo 13 thing, like something's going wrong up there. How are the people on the ground going to help to figure out a solution? How are the people up there going to figure out how to, and there's a ticking time clock. That's the stuff Matt and I love to watch, and yes, we've gotten better at it. I feel like we know, because I think the things that are unique to the show that I think we've embraced is silence too. A lot of movies, TV shows, when they're in space, there's sound effects. There's that thing of to really make it tense. We really early on, as much as people are like, are you sure you want to do this? Just silence, you're just going to go with silence. And I have to say, I'm so glad we stuck with our guns there, because it right away puts you in a space of eeriness. And that thing you're seeing, this things happen and you're hearing nothing. And then being able to interplay the what's happening on the ground. I think in the end, this show very much is about, like you're saying, the triumph of the human spirit and the triumph of every individual, that one person can change history. I think is an integral part of what this show is saying season to season, that, Danielle Poole saying, you know what, I'm going to do this mission. I'm going to shake that hand, in spite of the orders. She changed history. And I think that is a powerful moment. It's a moment that I think we keep talking about in the show, that the ability of these characters, and the reason I think you care about these characters in those moments is because also we spend a lot of time talking about the characters and their backstory and their struggles. So when they're in that moment, the reason I think you care is because you've seen the journey they've been on.
Well, our last question is more pondering, and I don't imagine you're going to give Johnny Pappas your plans for the future, but the question reads, in the show, the technological leap of fusion energy has changed the energy equation on Earth, and Johnny wonders if we will leave the solar system with new methods of propulsion. So I'll open that. And
excellent question. There's always the hope for the future. Without getting into too much about that, but I do think, look, if you told people 100 years ago that we would be sending people to the moon or doing a lot of things, or flying in planes, or doing video calls with people on little boxes, they would have been like, what kind of magician are you? So us now, 100 years from now, who knows what's possible. And I think that's one of the fun things about our show, is that we're always looking to, what is that, even if it's a stretch, even if it's a long way off, how can we ground it and bring that idea to reality? And I think nuclear fusion is one of those things that's like, it's always kind of in the ether of, oh, if we could just crack this amazing, energy resource, it would change everything about the world in really positive ways. But of course, in our show, we also show how there are unintended negative consequences to a lot of those amazing scientific developments in terms of putting people out of work or changing the fabric of society in a way that unsettles things in a way you don't know how it's going to resolve itself. But that's the tension of our show, I think, is these amazing advancements and the unintended consequences of that and how it impacts people on the ground. But I think it would be awesome if we can eventually get out of the solar system, especially seeing those James Webb pictures.
Yeah, maybe season 14. We'll see. We'll get there.
14.
Someone's got to get Apple on the phone and make that commitment. Well, thank you to everybody for your great questions. And as moderator, I would not be doing my job if I didn't end by asking for a little tease of where we're going in these last 3 episodes. So what can you tell us? Of course, the 8th episode hits tonight or tomorrow, depending on where you are in the world. And we're headed toward the finale in a couple weeks. So.
I think, as is our tradition, it feels like every season, a lot of those threads, the story threads we've been building over the season will come to a head. I mean, we don't like to leave a lot on the table by the end. We like to kind of answer the questions. And I think, seeing as we've been building this season, we really were ambitious in terms of how big we go. And I feel like if you enjoyed the ride so far, then you're going to love these last few episodes. There's a lot of surprises, a lot of twists and turns, and it's pretty epic, I have to say. And I have to credit like the actors and the crew, because we set out to really, what it ended up being is like a feature for that last episode.
Literally a feature. It's so
long. It's really long. But in Apple's defense, they're like, I don't know what you cut from that. So it felt like one of those things where we didn't want to. When we set out this season, we're like, let's not do the big finale again. Let's try to, but then inevitably things just push up and get bigger and bigger as we got to the end. So we're really happy with how it turned out. It's pretty epic. And I think I don't want to give away anything, because I think part of the fun of this show is not knowing before you watch. So I'd encourage to avoid hearing or reading anything before you watch it.
Good advice. Matt, I'll give you the last word.
Oh man, Ben said that so well. I'm just gonna say ditto.
Perfect note to end on. Well, thank you both so much for this really just incredibly informative and interesting panel. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming to watch and listen and submit your great questions. And yeah, keep watching For All Mankind, Apple TV Plus, new episodes Thursday night, Friday. I'm David Canfield. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.